I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1727 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran, along with none other than Dr. Robert M. Rodrigues, that renowned history professor from Duquesne University up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In this episode, he's going to be talking about the Nixon years in Vietnam, starting with the Pentagon Papers and going down to the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January of 1973. He begins his presentation today with a recording of the reactions to the Pentagon Papers release. You all remember that when Daniel Ellsberg, that patriot who had something heavy on his heart, he just had to divulge top-secret papers about the Vietnam War. The recording Dr. Rodrigues is going to play for us gives us the different reactions to that release. Some were favorable, some were not so favorable. You have to decide on your own what you think of Ellsberg's actions back in those days. Dr. Rodrigues is going to tell us about a time where he actually met Mr. Ellsberg. It was a very revealing conversation he had with the gentleman. Again, as I always do when we have such a distinguished presenter on this podcast, I ask that you put away all your distractions so you can devote all your attention to what he has to say, because it's that important. So without any further ado, Dr. Rodrigues, you have the microphone. Take it away and let us hear that recording of the reactions to the release of the Pentagon Papers.
Here we go.
We are going to win. Quit making national heroes out of those who steal secrets and publish them in the newspaper. The 100,000 for killing was unjustified homicide. And I couldn't see the difference between that and murder. Murder had to be stopped.
This weekend, portions of a highly classified Pentagon document came to light for all the world to see, brought cries of outrage from Washington.
We got to get this son of a bitch.
Yes, Kennedy did send troops in violation of the Geneva Accord. Johnson did start the build-up before he said he was going to. These guys were lying through their teeth when they were talking to us. And here it is in black and white. There's no way of denying it.
The Times building is encircled by armed guards. We are printing tomorrow a top-secret government document.
A name has now come out as the possible source of the Times Pentagon document. It is that of Daniel Ellsberg, the top policy analyst for the Defense and State Department.
I am prepared to answer to all the consequences of these decisions.
Henry Kissinger said that Daniel Ellsberg was the most dangerous man in America and he had to be stopped.
The study was 47 volumes, 7,000 pages. We're taking on sincerity.
We dropped another 200,000 tons of bombs on Indochina. That's 10 Hiroshimas. One Hiroshima a week.
What has remained significant about the release of the Pentagon Papers is the decision by a public official to give priority to conscience as compared to career.
Daniel Ellsberg, whatever his intentions, gave aid and comfort to the enemy.
Okay, so, you have obviously mixed accounts. The United States government was they saw Daniel Ellsberg as a spy, as a traitor, and of course Ellsberg felt that he had to reveal the behind-the-scenes decisions that were being made regarding Vietnam and the continuation of the war. I had the opportunity in 2002 to meet Daniel Ellsberg in Lubbock, Texas, at a Vietnam conference at Texas Tech. He was quite engaging. I happened to be sitting at the table that he came to sit and eat lunch with after he had been a keynote. And he was the first one talking at that table. It was funny that he said to all of us there, he said, "I'll tell you another secret." He said, during Dien Bien Phu, President Eisenhower offered 3 atomic bombs to Charles de Gaulle to drop on Dien Bien Phu. We were all startled. I'd never heard that before. And since then, I've seen it in books. So Ellsberg is still revealing secrets, as we could say. By December 26th of 1971, the United States begins the bombing of North Vietnam, called a Christmas bombing. December 31st, our troop strength is down to 140,000. This is from the apex of 543,400 in 1969. The killed in action count was 2,357. 1972, in February of 1972, Richard Nixon opens up relations with communist Red China. Okay, now this was probably long overdue. When Mao Zedong captured China in 1948, they turned it into communist, to a communist state, 48, 49, and we saw that as a de facto government, but not a de jure government. So therefore, the United States rejected Mao Zedong's leadership. He said, well, he stole it. He's not the legal one. So therefore, we cannot acknowledge him. So from that time, late 40s until 1972, the United States essentially closed its eyes and ears to Red China. And we recognize Taiwan as the real China. Taiwan, of course, is an island there. This got to be old at this point, to assume that a country didn't exist when it was the largest country in the world, had the most people in the world. Actually, second largest to the Soviet Union, but the most people in the world. Nixon opened it up, and this was a coup. This was, you look at Nixon's presidency, this is one of his high points, that he opened up Red China to the United States and to have international relations with this huge country, our status today. On March 30th, North Vietnam launches a major attack into South Vietnam. This is called the Easter Offensive. Some historians say that this offensive had been planned earlier, but was delayed because of the casualties, the high amount of casualties that North Vietnam, the NBA, had taken at Lam Song 719. See, so Lam Song 719 had a lot of repercussions, both to the South Vietnamese, to the United States, and to North Vietnam. On April 15th, because of this Easter offensive, the United States, Richard Nixon, resumes the bombing of North Vietnam, and particularly Hanoi and Haiphong. But then something happens that's very significant in June of 1972, and that is the infamous Watergate hotel break-in. At the time, the Watergate was a hotel, and the Democratic machine, the Democratic headquarters, had a suite in the hotel, and there was a break-in at night by what they called the creep. It was the Watergate criminals, the Committee to Re-elect the President, and they used the initials CREEP. This was discovered by a security guard, and Watergate hearings that are going to really kind of bring down the United States President Richard Nixon. He was at a very high approval rating at this time. Watergate was still not gaining any tread with the American people. So in the 1972 election, Nixon won in a complete landslide against George McGovern. As the Watergate investigations continued, the Vietnamese communist negotiators at Paris, they saw this as a weakness, and that the President of the United States was now weakened by this Watergate conspiracy and the break-in and the hearings that were going along with it. So they saw no reason to negotiate with the United States. They saw a defanged president. In December of 1972, Nixon unleashed heavy bombing of North Vietnamese cities, Hanoi and Haiphong. Very heavy. These were productive bombing. They unleashed a lot of firepower on Hanoi. And in fact, we know now that at this point, North Vietnam was considering a truce because they had been really beaten up. And now, the truce would have been a temporary stay in the war because it's pretty certain that they would have come back into the field and challenged the authority of the United States as well as South Vietnam. They wanted it to be united. This was their true goal. But at this time, they were limping. The attacks were condemned by the international community, and they forced Nixon to reconsider his negotiation strategy in Paris. Now, by August of 1972, the last United States combat troops are going to leave Vietnam. Support troops remain. By December, the full-scale bombing of North Vietnam is resumed. Nixon took a pause to let all the hullabaloo about it to subside and all the international and public reaction, and he went back and he continued to bomb. Understand that Richard Nixon, despite his pronouncements that he was going to bring the war to a close and turn it over to the South Vietnamese, he still had his hand on the controls. And what he wanted to do was to somehow affect the negotiations in Paris by putting maximum pressure on the North Vietnamese. By December 31st of 1972, the troop strength of the United States in Vietnam were 24,200. Now, that's quite a couple. We hadn't been that low since 1963. And the killed in action amounted to 640. Finally, by January of 1973, the United States had conducted an agreement with the North Vietnamese. This is pretty much between Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho from North Vietnam. Significantly enough, South Vietnam was not part of those secret negotiations. So Nguyen Van Tu, the South Vietnamese president, he rejected this. He said he would not agree with this because partly what the agreement did was we turned a blank eye to the fact that there were North Vietnamese troops still in South Vietnam. This had been a major stumbling block in the negotiations. The United States and South Vietnam had wanted North Vietnam troops to move across the 17th parallel back into North Vietnam. But they did not want to do that. They wanted to just maintain their ground that they had achieved. And essentially at this time now, you have a United States pulling troops out at a rapid pace, pressure internally in the United States to get out of the war. You had a president who had lost some of his luster and power because of the Watergate hearings and the questions of his actions with regard to all of the events. Watergate is just a catch name for many, many indiscretions that were discovered under the Nixon regime. Nguyen Van Tu would not officially accept this. In fact, he went on national TV and said that this was not a good deal for South Vietnam. On January 23rd, the final draft of the treaty was initialed by Kissinger, Secretary of State now, not National Security Advisor, and Le Duc Tho of Vietnam. Incidentally, both of these men were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize later that year. And both of these men failed to turn up to receive the Nobel Prize. And presumably, both felt that this would have been a secret deal. There had been some unspoken acknowledgments to the sense that once the United States leaves Vietnam, North Vietnam is pretty much free to do what it would. 73 is the real breaking point, because at this point the United States taste and stomach for the war had been pretty much gutted. We'll stop there, Mac. This is a critical juncture as we reach toward the end of the Vietnam War. There's still a big final chapter, and that is the imminent fall of Saigon, which is going to occur by April the 30th, 1975. Okay, thanks. See you next time.
Thank you, Dr. Bob, for that excellent description of what happened in Vietnam from the time of the Pentagon Papers up to January the 23rd, 1973, when we signed the Paris Peace Accords, which, in effect, sealed the doom of South Vietnam. Looking forward to your next episode, where you will talk about the ultimate fall of Saigon in 1975, which was a sad day for all Vietnam veterans. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1727 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these programs. You are cordially invited to come again soon and often to listen to more that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?